So to get things started, the first type of cabling that I would like to talk to you about is one that's called twisted pair. Now, twisted pair cabling, I have a few illustrations for you here. The top one is what a twisted pair cable would look like just to the average person who's looking at a cable. And you might be looking at that and you're thinking to yourself, isn't that an Ethernet cable? And the answer is yes, that's exactly what it is. Twisted pair cabling is your most commonly used Ethernet cable. The other illustrations that I have for you are showing you a little bit more about what the inside of that cable looks like. Okay, the part that you don't see, the part that's hidden. And to be more specific, we'll talk about this here, but the middle picture there is just your standard Ethernet cable, your standard twisted pair cable. And then the one below it has an extra layer of shielding on it, and it's called shielded twisted pair cabling. So we'll get to that in a minute. Jumping a little ahead of myself. Let's first talk about the different categories of twisted pair cabling. And there's a number of different categories, but the ones that I want you to probably pay the most attention to, because they're the ones that you will see out there most often, are the four I have listed. I have what's called Cat 3, Cat 5, Cat 5e, and Cat 6. Now, Cat 3, or Category 3, is a type of twisted pair cable that can handle data speeds up to a maximum of 10 megabits per second. Whereas Category 5 can handle up to 100 megabits per second, and Categories 5e and Category 6 can handle up to 1,000 megabits per second, or what's sometimes referred to as a gigabit. Right? If you ever heard gigabit Ethernet. Now, one thing that you might be thinking right now is, well, what really is the difference between these different cables? Right? What makes it that one is rated at 10 megabits, one's at 100, and another is at 1,000? Well, if you look at the middle picture, where I show you that the inside of the cable itself is made up of all these wires, and if you look carefully, and we'll talk about the specifications before this lesson's over, but if you look carefully, well, first of all, what looks like a wire at the very top is not. That's just an extra piece of filling. It's actually there to help you sometimes rip away at the cable. And the one at the very bottom is more of a ground cable. But if you look at the colored wires in the middle, the ones that are green and orange, and it looks red, but it's actually brown, believe it or not, in blue, you'll see that there's actually two wires of that color, or that related color. And those wires are twisted around one another, right? Hey, is this starting to come together? Why it's called twisted pair cabling? It's because each pair of wires are twisted. Now, why are they twisted? The reason they are twisted, and this is just a real quick electrical engineering 101. When you have two electrical wires and they are running in perfect parallel with each other, right? If they're just running straight through, right next to each other, as the signal travels along, and really I shouldn't even say signal because we're just talking about electricity here, as current travels along, you actually get what's called signal bleed. Okay, so the electricity actually emits outside of the wire itself, and it can then interfere with the wire next to it. When you twist the wires around one another, that does not happen. And that's the reason why we are twisting the wires. So now that we know why a twisted pair cable is called twisted pair, right, and the reason why we do twist those wires, let's go back to the question of, well, what makes something rated at 10 megabits versus 100 versus 1,000? And the real simple answer is it has to do with the number of twists. The more twisted it is, I know that sounds a little crazy. People say that about me. The more twisted you are, but the more twisted the wires are, the faster the data can travel. Okay, now, I don't want you to worry yourself too much about the specs and the whys and all that. I just thought I'd give you a real basic lesson on that. Now, one other thing that you do need to know is that regardless of the category and the speed, when it comes to twisted pair cabling, a single cable can carry data up to a distance of 100 meters, not feet. Yeah, a lot of people get that confused. They think it's 100 feet. No, it's 100 meters before suffering from something called attenuation. Now, attenuation is basically the deterioration of a signal over distance. And it can also have to do with the number of connections as well. The more times you connect a cable to a node, you can lose a bit of the signal. And the best way I like to describe attenuation so you can understand it is if you think of sound. In other words, if you and I were in a room together, or how about even forget that we're in a room together. Right now I'm talking to you on this recording and you're listening. Right? You're listening through either a headset or maybe the speakers on your computer. Okay, so hypothetically, let's say you're listening on the speakers on your computer. And if you're sitting close enough to the computer, you can hear me. But if you move away from the computer, you're not going to hear me as well, right? Because the sound will deteriorate over distance, right? It'll start to dissipate. And when you get far enough away from the computer, you will no longer hear the sound of my voice. That's attenuation. And in the case of the twisted pair cabling, the data can travel along that cable for a maximum of 100 meters before it attenuates to a point that a computer couldn't understand the signal anymore. Now, I mentioned when we first came to this slide here that we have unshielded twisted pair and shielded twisted pair. Unshielded twisted pair, which is just your standard twisted pair cable, can be susceptible to something called EMI, electromagnetic interference. And basically that EMI is the same thing that I was starting to describe to you before when I did the little electrical engineering 101 where you have two wires running in parallel and then they can bleed into each other. Now, you're not going to get EMI from within the cable. What you are going to have happen though is if the cable is running along some other cables that are giving off strong EMI or certain other devices that can give off strong EMI, okay, things like motors and generators and things like that can give off strong EMI, well then you will suffer from a much shorter attenuation than the 100 meters that the cable originally should have been able to handle. Okay, you're going to get that interference. If you are in that scenario where maybe you need to run cable through a generator room or something like that, then you're going to want to use something called shielded twisted pair. And that's the picture I have at the bottom. And the idea is that each of the pairs of wires have an extra layer of shielding around them to protect them from EMI. Now, the last thing that I want to mention here, and we're actually going to revisit this again in just a little bit, is that twisted pair cabling uses something called an RJ45 connector.